Thanks for the enthusiasm, Ben.
I'll laugh at anything. It's good.
Yeah. It's fine.
Thunderous.
Can we go to the next slide, or do I have a clicker? Super. Thank you so much. So happy to take you through our journey to also look at a couple of use cases, cities that we've been working with, but also digital twins. What's in a name? So we will show you a couple of examples, but also reflect with the panel, and if there's any questions on how can we apply it, who's going to use it, and what is the outcome and the outputs that we want to see. And I'll kick off the story to tell a little bit more about the Net Zero Urban program itself. It's a little bit more than just digital twins, but happy to then also pass over to Joel, who's going to do the introduction with me on the projects that we've been doing together. But just in a nutshell, on cities, and I think today's Cities Day, you hopefully picked it up, but just by the numbers alone, we need to look at cities as part of the solution. We have been hearing the last couple of days about many pledges, many ambitions, and fortunately also a couple of commitments. But I think just by the size of cities, by their emission consumption, by their energy consumption and emissions, we need to look at cities as part of the solution. And therefore, I think it's really important that we also start to look at a city in their complexity, their chaos sometimes, and how to address it. And this morning we saw the launch of CHAMP, a new partnership between local and national governments, and where I think if those who have been working in cities also need to add what's apart from that multi-level perspective, also that horizontal multi-actor perspective, where we bring together the public and the private sector when we look at a top-down and a bottom-up initiative on how to bring all of these elements together, and then also make it functional, actionable, and hopefully also investable. And that's where I want to draw the focus today on, if we start to embrace that complexity, what are a couple of entry points if we look on those long-term future? Where do we need to act? Who needs to be around the table? And what's the kind of business and value plan that we jointly need to design? Now, the way that we've been working the last 12 months, ever since Egypt, is to go and listen to a couple of cities. And I have the luck to also have been working for many years at the city networks, and to really understand, like, when we talk about challenges, many of those challenges are already known. It's not a question on what do we need to work on. We know where to start, but it's really a question on where to prioritize. How are we going to, as said, getting into that complexity and making sure that everybody's around the table, and that we go also to the right level of intervention. We can talk, of course, about cities, and there's many different cities. You can look at the global north, global south, small, medium-sized, large cities. I think it's important to look at that layer where many of those challenges are similar in cities across the world, where we can look at how are we going to retrofit the built environment, and what does that mean? How are we going to decarbonize high-rise in low-income neighborhoods? How are we going to do the energy transition in cities that sometimes don't have the capacity or don't have the investment possibilities? It's that kind of layer that we want to address, and that's where data is really important, where we start to see on what is the data available, how can we unlock that, and how can we then draw meaningful scenarios for policy and also investment. And Joel, I think that's been the fun journey together to see we get the challenge, and then what? We know where to find the data, and then we're going to put it in a black box, and we're going to see what's come out.
Yeah, so I'm going to talk to you and explain a little bit about the digital twins and how we're using the digital twins to really understand that data we have available to us. So, humans, we're really creative. We're still more creative than machines. There's lots of things out there with artificial intelligence, but I still think we've got that creative edge over what machines are able to do. But machines are far better at processing data than we ever have been. And they're getting better and better all the time. And what we need to do is we need to connect that speed of machines with processing with the creativity of the humans and really allow us to work together. Now, how are we going to do this connection? At the moment, data is sitting in machines and it's acted and used by data scientists and people who understand that data. It's not in a method which is easy for us as humans to understand. We need to make it into a world that we're used to, into that world we can work with. And that's where we want to put it into a visual format. Humans are so much better at understanding data through a visual format, 60,000 times better than understanding text. That's not like once or twice, that's quite a big difference. So we've really got to bring it into that visual format and allow people to understand all that complex data really, really fast. Cities are trying to make decisions based on loads and loads of experts who have all of the data, all of the information, and they're writing pages and pages, 60-page reports, 100-page reports, which nobody has time or energy to read and understand. We need to make that understandable and easily translatable to all of the people who are making the decisions and the public itself. And we don't have the time to try everything in real life. Things are changing really, really fast, and if we don't change things fast, then we're going to be in real trouble. Now, if we go out there and we say, okay, well, we've got this good idea, let's go and test it, and then it doesn't actually work, that's not really a good thing. We don't have decades to make changes. We've got to do it at speed, and that means we've got to test it at speed. Testing things in real life takes too long. Testing things in a digital world, you can do in minutes. Not days, not months, not even years. You can do it in minutes. You can put things in, you've got the real data, and you say, is this going to work or is it not? If it fails, fail fast in a machine, don't fail in real life. And then when it does make sense and we can start to test out all those creative ideas we've got as humans, then we can take it forward and start to implement it. So a digital twin allows us to test that information. It allows us to visualize that information in just minutes. Putting in all that information, testing out, seeing, okay, this works, this doesn't work, and put together really complex different scenarios. Most people have spent years and years refining and become experts in their fields. And we see so many silos out there where you have real experts and they're trying to make improvements of maybe 5%, 10%. If we start to put those silos together, then suddenly we're not looking at 5% or 10% improvements. We can look at 10-fold improvements when we start to see the gaps between the different silos and start to make those silos work together. So we need to unlock those insights. And as Jorn already mentioned, one of the first questions I get when we start talking about digital twins is, what data should we go and start getting? What data should we go and create? And I'm like, let's just use some of that data we've got. We've got so much data out there we're not using. Everybody talks about data, and actually one of my pet hate words is big data. The first thing I ask people when they talk about big data, I'm like, so what are you actually using it for? And they go, oh, well, we're not using it yet, but we've got these hard drives full of it. And I was like, well, can we start to activate it and start to use it to really start to make change? And the digital twin allows us to bring that together and to start to make those changes and see where we can add value. So we've got many different areas. We've got capital out there, and there is capital to do these projects. But the point is that it's too risky. People don't want to risk trying a new design or a new solution without understanding the risks related to it. So we've got to de-risk it before we're willing to put the capital in for the changes. We've got cities which were sitting there with thousands of problems which need to be solved. And then we've got lots of really creative people with really good ideas. Now let's bring those three together, chuck them into a digital twin, and in high speed test out, would this work, would this work, would this work, go through all those different scenarios, and then use that as a tool to activate and really start to make our journey to sustainable cities much faster. And along the way, we're going to make some big differences to quite a number of the other sustainable development goals we're trying to aim at. So I'm going to take you forward from where we were last year. Last year, we launched the program, and we were just looking at 4 cities. We had Stavanger in Norway, Aberdeen, Sharm el-Sheikh, where COP was last year, and Dubai, where we are here. And we were looking at how to take these cities to net zero, what things they've got in place, what challenges they've got in front of them. Now, I'm not going to go through all these cities, but I'm going to show you how we've built up from then to now, and we're continuing on a journey. And it's not like this is a one-off project. This is a continuing project and a continuing journey we're going to be walking through. So let me start off by taking you to Stavanger, which was one of the cities we showed last year. Like the UAE, Norway and particularly Stavanger is a big oil and gas place. It's got a huge history in oil and gas, but if they can change and they can be seeing how to change, then we can all change. Yes, they've got more money, and I'm going to come to that later, but here what we're doing is we're looking at a systems approach, how all the systems can be used to understand how to get into net zero. So the first thing was emissions on land. They've got policies to get all of their electric vehicles, 80% electric vehicles and 100% electric buses, and that really brings them on target. We showed last year how the marine traffic was actually creating 3 times the amount of CO2, and actually they've already started to put in a quayside charging dock, which is going to make a huge difference to that. And then we've already started to look at where they're going to get the new energy from. So this is a really nice test case. We looked at different methods for carbon capture. We looked at seaweed and showed it was good, but really not an ideal solution because the amount of area you would need to look at. And then we looked at some of the first carbon capture devices, and this is already being planned now to be put in place. So this is a really nice example in Norway of a city which is well on track to be net zero by 2030. And it's very easy to look at that and say, well, great, but that's Norway. They've got a lot of money, they're already ahead, it's easy to do that. So we need to look at some other places. But let me just take you to one other place in Norway before we start zooming off around the world. So a few cities we looked at here was another one in Norway border, and we've looked at 2 in India, and then I'm going to take you through a few more after that to really show you how we can be starting to use these technologies to make some big differences. So right at the top of Norway, where they call it the gateway to the Arctic. It's pretty cold, but it's a nice city, and it's going to be European Capital of Culture in 2024. So this city is redesigning the whole city. They're going to build a new airport, and they've used the digital twin themselves, not with our help. They've gone in and they've put in all of the data themselves to actually redesign how they can rebuild the whole city, and not just rebuild the whole city, but make sure it's sustainable from day one. And really, they put some really high levels targets on that, and not just understanding sustainability, but also understanding the risks which are coming up within the next 100 years and how they can mitigate those risks and understand what's going on. I'm not going to take you through all the data here, but they're bringing in live data to be able to tune simulations, because of however good a simulation is, it's never going to be perfect. So actually bringing in live data allows you to tune that and then make very good predictions as you move forward with what you're working with. So again, another example of a city which is going to easily hit the target of net zero by 2030. Now let's move over to some cities which are going to really struggle. So here we've just started some projects with 2 cities in India, 2 very large cities who've got some really, really big challenges and some really, really big problems. But having big problems also means they're really, really open and willing to change. So they've been really, really positive. We're starting to put in some data there, and we see very quickly there are so many areas where with small changes and being able to inform the public, being able to inform the politicians, and to work together on that, we can start to get things to change very, very fast. I mean, we're looking at one of the most beautiful cities in India, and it has some huge problems. And I'm going to talk a little bit about flooding later on, and you'll see how some of the examples we're looking at with flooding, which you see here as being a massive problem for the city in India, we can use other cities to push forward the technologies, and then we can share these ideas to really start to progress and move forward with how we can solve things. So I showed you a taste of 3 of the new cities we've been working with, and there the focus has been directly to take things to net zero. But we've learned over the last year, if we've been talking to cities, there's much more than just taking a city to net zero. We also need to understand what's going on in that journey. Global temperatures, whatever happens now, global temperatures are changing. The world is changing, the climate is changing, so we need to be prepared for how those changes are happening. So as well as preparing the cities for how we can get to net zero, we've got to understand the issues which they're heading into. So here we show Bordeaux, and we're able to use technology here to understand where the hot areas are within the city, and then what we can do is natural interventions to really take down this heat, so where we can put in greener areas to really reduce those high levels of heat within the city, which is one of the problems this city is facing. We're back over to Norway here, and we show rainfall. A lot of the solutions for transport have been based on public transport, which I can tell you quite openly works very, very well on a nice day in Norway. But when it's raining or snowing and pretty cold, the first thing you do is going to grab your car. So we've got to understand how we can change the models of behavior people are using and make it the behavior that people want to use. And then we're over to Poland and we're looking at flooding, and I'm going to talk quite a bit about flooding today, just as it's one of the examples which has really come up with a lot of the cities we've been working with. So Swansea. This has been a project we only started about a month ago, and I have to say big thank you to everybody in Swansea who is able to give us this data so fast, and it shows you that there is so much data sitting out there, and I'm going to show you just a taste of it today. But we were able to build a digital twin in just a couple of weeks and put this together to show you today, and it's going to be a continued journey, and we've had really good support from the council, from the universities, and for everybody involved in the area. So we fly over from India to Swansea, and what we were able to do is put together the basic digital twin and really start to understand, and there is a huge amount of development going on in Swansea at the moment to really see how they can use investment to really bring the city to the level they want it to be, but also to make sure that they're on that journey to net zero. We've been able to do LiDAR scans to get real close ideas of how the cities is, and then start to overlay where the building developments will come into place and understand those changes and see how we can make those changes most effective and allow them themselves to test out. So quickly just throw in models and say, what happens if we do this? What happens if we do this? One thing is to look at it, but then understanding what changes it will make to the total system. So here we show that they're going to be developing a large area down by the ocean side, and then we start to show how this is going to make a huge problem for their road network system. So we can start to see all of these interconnections between the systems and understanding the full systems. We're also showing some basic flood simulation stuff here, and this is a 1,000-year flood. So if you're living in Swansea or you've ever seen this, don't stress. This isn't going to happen tomorrow, but this is the possibility of what could happen in a 1,000-year flood. And then we start to look at what options they've got for really creating energy for that net zero transition. So one thing which has been modelled and tested out is a tidal lagoon, and we can understand the direct capacity for that and understand how using that could move things forward. And then we're also looking, and there is huge areas, not just off Swansea, but all along the south coast of Wales and the ocean between Ireland and Wales, where they're going to be putting in loads and loads of wind turbines. And actually the two big ports on either side of Swansea are going to be key to that transition. So it's about understanding not just the city, but all of the network and everything which fits behind that. Now, the last example of a city I'm going to give you today is Ithaca. Now, this is a city in northern New York State, and we're really pleased to be able to work with this city. It is the first city in America which committed to net zero by 2030, which is pretty ambitious and pretty impressive, and we're really, really glad. And we're really glad that they opened their doors to us, welcomed us in, and started to give us data to really, really go in and analyse everything which was going on here. So we're flying over to Ithaca, and again, we're in the beginning of the process here, but we've created the digital twin of the whole of Ithaca, and we have Cornell University in there, which you'll be hearing from in a bit. So we created it, and we're looking at, again, the whole systems approach, and with that target to hit per 2030, we've got to understand all the different elements, but I'm not going to take you through all those elements now. I'm going to focus on just the issue of flooding. So with this issue of flooding, we were very lucky to be working with a company which is able to use artificial intelligence, to use satellite imagery and lots of data to really understand from past floodings to make very, very good predictions down to meter levels of where flooding is going to be. So you can see here, we're looking at the 100-year rainfall event, looking at how that is built up, and then looking at where that gets to a point where we're starting to block roads as just one example. We could be using it for anything. But here we overlay in where all of the emergency services are and where all of the key places are where they need to be getting from. And we see straight away, even with not very large rainfall, we're going to suddenly block the ambulances. You're not going to get your ambulances out of that key place. And we can put in methods to really focus on how we can solve these problems to achieve things better. We're also looking at how policies can change. One of the policies at the moment is that they're trying to get more and more people to use heat pumps. And those heat pumps are generally mounted in people's basements, which isn't very good if your house is going to be flooded. So we're actually looking at how we can change the policies to put those in different places. So many, many things in place to really understand how we can accelerate that and make sure the investments are used in the correct direction. I have thrown a huge amount of information at you in just a few minutes, and I'm very sorry about that, and I'm sorry if I've overloaded you with information, but I wanted to give you a taste of what's happening in this journey and a taste of what we're working with these cities. The more cities we get on board, the faster this process will become and the more we can learn from each other. That's what's so great about this, that a city doesn't compete directly with another city. If they're learning about something, most of these cities are sitting with similar problems, and if we can start to solve things in one city, we can translate that across to another city and see how we can start to work together. And we're only going to do this if we do work together. This program is started off by KPMG, but it's really about bringing as many people together to really make this a fast-moving program and to really help with this urban transition we want to make happen. So I'd like to first of all just add some quick acknowledgements to all the people who've been involved in giving us a lot of data. And this is only some of them, but I wanted to do that. And then I think with that, I am basically at a close and we're moving over to the panel debate. So back to you, Jon. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Joel. And as said, you did throw a lot of information at us. Now, when I look at the stories and the meetings I had with Susan, with you and other mayors, I think it's a day-to-day reality where you say this is actually an office day, like challenges on flooding, challenges on just mobility issues, congestion, air pollution, you name it. To be really clear, for us, the digital twin is not a goal in itself. It's really a tool. And therefore, these kind of meetings are really important to better understand how do we use them, what kind of information do we need, and what is then also the next step in terms of how are we going to disclose those scenarios that we take out for investment, for policy making, you name it. So, Susan, maybe happy to first come to you and to ask the question, how are you going about that complexity today, and where do you feel these are elements where we can better use the data, but also drive better scenarios?
Yeah, so we're at a relatively early stage in our journey in Glasgow. We're working with partners. Can you hear me? Is this working?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. We're working with partners to develop a digital twin and a 3D urban model that allows us to plan all these scenarios in a city that has quite a challenging urban landscape and challenging aspects about the physical nature of it and how we respond and adapt to those as we're implementing climate change solutions, but also just day-to-day policy in the council as well. For me as a city leader, it is very much about that practical application, but also in a time of constrained fiscal circumstances for cities, the real attraction is being able to test something out without spending the money to do so and then discovering that it hasn't worked. So being able to do multiple iterations of testing before we actually then get to making the final investment into something is an extremely attractive use of a digital twin for a city like Glasgow. And I think also there's something about its ability to allow us to plan some really quick wins in our climate interventions. We've got some really challenging things to deliver over a long period of time that we're not going to be able to deliver in 6 months or even 2 or 3 years, like retrofitting 430,000 homes, for example. That's a 10 or 15-year project, but it is something absolutely essential. Building our Clyde Metro is a 30-year project, probably. But in the meantime, we can use the digital twin to address some of our urban challenges and look at how we can turn them into opportunities. So Glasgow has a very large amount of vacant and derelict post-industrial land, for example, more than any other city in the UK. We're probably Europe's preeminent post-industrial city in many respects. And not all of that vacant and derelict land is equal. We can't go in and use it in exactly the same way, but some of it can be used immediately for greening. For example, some of it could be used for community growing, but some of it's too toxic to be used for that purpose, and it will take hundreds of millions of pounds to remediate and detoxify it. So can we, in the meantime, use that for solar array, for example, which the toxicity, it won't be a problem there. What's suitable for development as well, and as we're doing that development, how do we use a digital twin to map good urban realm, good green urban realm within new development. So there's just one particular challenge that we have in Glasgow, that a digital twin can allow us to innovate and experiment before we actually have to spend a penny of public money, which is extremely precious just now. 70% of Glaswegians live in flats, so if they have private electric vehicles, they don't have garages or driveways to plug them into. So we need to find other spaces, hubs for charging electric vehicles. But we can use a digital twin to map where the most useful and helpful and effective places to site charging hubs for EV are. We can use a digital twin to decide where we need to prioritise our flooding mitigation, flood risk mitigation measures, which are required all over the city, but in some places much more urgently than others. So that will allow us to rank and prioritise investment in flood risk mitigation across the city. So there's a whole number of areas where we can deliver pretty quick wins, things that are not necessarily going to be enormously expensive or require very difficult technical solutions. But if we just, to use a Glaswegian term, if we just breenge in without actually doing the homework first and without checking, as we so often have had to do in the past because we haven't had tools like this, and then 6 months later you go, no, that was the wrong place, we shouldn't have put it there, but you've spent the money, and then you have to spend more money moving it to the place that you should have put it in the first place. We can avoid all of that, and I think save ourselves a lot of time, a lot of money, and actually a lot of reputational risk as well, which I think is really important. And it brings me to my final point of where I think perhaps this is most exciting for me, is the ability to provide visual models and visual imaginings of interventions around climate to engage with citizens and engage with residents in a way that allows them to genuinely see and visualize what this will look like in their neighbourhoods and what it might look like in their day-to-day lives. I think that's particularly exciting. We're the only UK city to be a member of the Open Government Partnership, and it's very clear to me that the richness of data that a digital twin can provide for us, our ability to share that with communities in a way and then support them to access it in a way that's meaningful, that actually allows them to not just visualise but shape and inform local climate plans in a way that they then have something of a good idea how it's going to turn out, rather than just going into it in the dark. I think that's incredibly valuable in a landscape where we are doing a lot to people in a short space of time, and we're doing a lot to their places in a short space of time in ways that are potentially quite disruptive in order to hit our target of net zero by 2030. And I think that the digital twin and the tool that provides us, and the potential that provides, is a real way of potentially bridging the gap between ambition and our citizens and residents actually being able to visualise the reality of what that means for them.
Thank you so much, Susan, to share some insights from the city of Glasgow. You mentioned neighborhoods, but also visualization. Steve, I saw you nodding. You're here on behalf of Connected Places Catapult and 3CI and working with more than 90% of UK cities and municipalities. Not too limited to digital twin, but just looking at the data and tools. We've been working together and looking at how do we design pipelines of investable projects. And I think one of the elements that came back often is this idea of aggregation. To not look just at one city, but to see what is shared by multiple cities and how to make that also visual, how to make that tangible. How do we use data and tools to indeed accelerate and scale?
Well, I think first of all, is it working? Yeah. Are we on? Yeah. I'll just keep talking. I think first of all, first thing to say, I don't think we've fully realised the potential of digital twins and what they can do for cities. And I think we do need many more use cases, examples that you've demonstrated that demonstrate very clearly the impacts and benefits that digital twins provide. I'm afraid, I also apologise, but I'm old enough to remember version 1 of digital twins, which was a room half this size, and I used to work for Manchester, where we had a 3D model of the city, which every year we would pack up, put it in a lorry, and take it to the south of France to Mippin, show everybody how wonderful Manchester was, pack it up and bring it back. So for that reason alone, digital twins are a welcome new technology. I think to your point, Jorn, you talked around some of the work we've been doing together on net zero neighbourhoods. And just for those who don't know, this is a piece of work in the UK where we've identified 40 potential locations in the UK that could become net zero neighbourhoods based on the work we've been doing. And these are neighbourhoods of 1,000 residential properties. Something we need to map onto those properties themselves, of course, but also the other infrastructure assets around transport, around the opportunities for green and blue infrastructure, opportunities for renewable generation. So all of those are very physical, they're grounded in place, and we need to see them. But who needs to see them? And I think this is my point, really. We've also established an investment task force in conjunction with the City of London Corporation. And a number of those investors said, we need more data to make informed decisions on investment in those places. So there's a whole range of data here that needs to be explored and deployed, I think, into these models. Data on energy use, data on energy generation, but then critically, money that is spent by households, by asset owners on that energy, and money potentially that could be invested as well. So all of that is being invested, all of that really is being asked for, not just by cities, but by investors too. So it's quite a large audience. And the third point, Susan obviously mentioned it, for me, is that the real opportunity then is about community engagement. Because we can develop the most complex investment and funding models we like, but if we don't have the communities on board where many of this work will be undertaken in the place where they live and work and play, we've got a problem. So I think using digital twins as a consultation mechanism and to help them define how they want their place to grow, what they would like to see deployed in terms of net zero technology in their place is really, really critical. And is actually, if not done, is being identified as quite a major risk by the investment community if the communities aren't brought on board.
Talking about investment, Alice, I'm going to come to you. We had to send our slides beforehand, so my apologies, you're not on there. But I think I want to build on the conversations we had over the many years. And speaking to you with, I think, your former hat at the World Economic Forum, your hat at Arab nowadays, but also the hat you wear linked to the SDG Urban Investment Initiative. And I always get the name wrong. But when we talk about investment, when we talk about, indeed, how to help cities, how do we bring all those elements together? And again, it doesn't have to be about digital twin, but more, how do we tackle that complexity and translate that into something operational?
Thank you, and thank you for having me. First of all, I think as a private sector person, we often hear this narrative, particularly from the public sector, oh, let's bring in the private sector. And it's like we're wheeled in generally when something's done. And I think, first of all, from the public sector side, there's a real lack of understanding of private sector needs. And from the private sector side, there's a real lack of understanding of public sector needs. And there can be a lack of trust. And, particularly with regard to PPP projects, many projects went wrong in the past. So there's an unwillingness from the public sector to take that risk again. So what needs to happen? So I think, first of all, you'll always hear from the private sector side, they say the same thing. We have lots of money. We have a lack of bankable projects. And I heard that again and again and again on Finance Day here at COP. And what they mean by that is generally there is a lack of projects with the risk profile and structure that actually will attract investment. And if we break that down to a country level and a city level, generally what you don't have within a city is a pipeline of transition projects that are properly prepared that will enable them to attract investment, but equally that isn't scaled up at the country level. So, for example, you're part of Core Cities UK, Susan. So really what they're looking for is the core cities of the UK to have a single pipeline of projects. That's very difficult. It's difficult to achieve, particularly when we think about in most places in the world, we have different political leadership between national government and city government. It's difficult to achieve because in many of the cities in the world, there's a real lack of capacity. They don't have financial people. And, in terms of what I do in Arup, whether it's projects that relate to the decarbonisation of transport or, the decarbonisation of energy or buildings or urban planning, no matter what it is, most cities will tell me they don't have anybody with expertise in developing a business case for that project. They will set the vision, but they don't actually have any expertise to help them implement and make that a reality. The other thing is that out of fear, they generally don't bring in the private sector to tell them how they think, so they procure the wrong things. We constantly find this on our mega infrastructure projects. The government will come to us and say, when they're about to procure, this is what we're going to procure if we're lucky. And we will say, well, sorry, things have really moved on. This is where we're at in terms of how we build. This is how we utilize technology now. And if they have that conversation, they can change it. But in many cases, they don't have that conversation before procurement. So they procure the wrong things. And that's a really significant problem. And coming back to digital twins, we use it a lot, so particularly on mega infrastructure projects in cities. And if I give an example, we'll do it at the subterranean level, we do it at the surface level, we do it at the aerial level. And for mega infrastructure projects, there's huge risks attached to them. There's a huge risk of encountering constraints that you otherwise wouldn't know about until you break ground. There is huge risk of cost overrun. And one project that exemplifies that quite well for us is, we have over many years been developing the MTR network in Hong Kong. Some of our projects go underground, some go underwater, and some do both. So where we can use subterranean level digital twin technology, it enables us to get a better sense of the risks that we might encounter and come up with optimal route planning. And when we're actually constructing, that metro line, we are less likely to have to stop, rethink, find an alternative when we're in the midst of construction, and we're more likely able to deliver it on time and on budget. And equally projects that we're doing in Copenhagen in that regard, in Auckland, the high-speed rail project in California, etc., they all are coming from a similar premise. I guess other projects, and coming back to the community participation piece, I'm working on some major transport decarbonisation projects in various cities at the moment, and indeed in countries. And it's always remarkable when focus group research is done on people, before you actually embark on consultation within those cities or countries. And things like the 15-minute neighbourhood has grown such arms and legs in terms of misinformation on social media that when that is discussed with them, they think that's a really bad thing. But when you start to break down in those discussions the elements of a 15-minute city, then they like it. So I guess what we learn from that experience is that often people can't tangibly understand what you're talking about when you're talking about decarbonising transport or, you know, reallocation of road space to enable people to walk or cycle, or provision of local services, you know, near to where you live, work and play. So this is where a digital twin can be really, really useful. If you start to show people what your city might look like if you decarbonise transportation and in public consultation, and they're able to visualise it, then they have a real understanding. So you're able to address, you know, this sort of misinformation issue that we constantly see. And I think that's really important. Like, you know, I heard a statistic here at COP that 50% of the world is going to have elections next year. And where we are in the world right now in this misinformation age, it's really important that we're able to put facts in front of people. And I think that's what digital twin technology can help us with.
On facts and technologies, Ben, I come to you
Sure.
in a minute. Khalid, I'm going to first come to you because we launched the program last year in Egypt, and I remember your colleague Rene from Johnson Controls coming to me saying, like, we're working today with building information modeling, but how can we see that market of the future? And when Alice was talking about procurement and knowing what to procure and not always having the technical capacity to see what is the solution that's actually being proposed, how do you go from a company perspective like Johnson Controls, when we know that there's more and more questions and challenges on flooding, but also urban heat islands, how to bring the technology at the right scale to make sure that we can also address those problems?
Yeah. Can you hear me, by the way? If you think about it, like buildings makes up communities, communities makes up villages, and villages makes up cities. So you have to go back all the way, and that's what we believe in, all the way to the building level. Now, digital twin for us is so crucial. I would summarize it maybe on two fronts: the pre-design, commissioning and installation, and the post. And both are as important, actually. Now, if you think about it from how do we utilize and how do we use on the pre, you have, take 2030 as the targets for the climate, so that should trigger down to what buildings, either in new or sometimes actually retrofitted, should look like by that time. You have in a building multiple technologies. You have the HVAC, the controls, the fire, the securities, and you have to start thinking about it as end-to-end, not in silos. It's good to understand what's happening in silos for each one of these, but to get the maximum benefit, you have to look at it from end-to-end. That's when digital twin actually comes into play for us, and that's when it becomes what-if type scenario, based on not just what's happening within these systems, what's happening with the architecture design of the building, what's happening with the material used in the building. It gives us a very clear understanding what should happen at the design stage. Back to your point earlier, from digital twin point of view, the visualization of actually what the performance will look like after you are complete. So that's one kind of fold of the whole formula. And then you go to the next one, which is after you deploy, you have the ability to collect our data from the systems, from the buildings, and then try to understand within digital twin, factoring in experiences of other buildings too. Trying to simulate, trying to model what-if scenarios to get the maximum performance potential. And then you start making the recommendation and making the performance improvements. So it's in two dimensions, actually. That's how we play it.
Thank you so much.
Sure.
Ben, I'm going to come to you. We already talked about Ethica and the project we're doing. And there was also the challenge on how to get everyone around the table, because you're part of the university, Cornell University.
Yeah.
We have been talking to the city, to the county. They all have a bit of data. We've also been talking to university in terms of what is the research that's been done and going on, how to bring all of those elements together. And if you look at what we've been doing with digital twins, it's not to say that's the exact scenario. It's to open up that dialogue and to also confront policymakers and also experts in the field, scientists, researchers, to say, how can we build on that initial model and further improve? but also how can we also look at the knowledge already available and bring that in?
Yeah, so first of all, thanks for having me. I came to Ithaca, or came to Cornell, I should say, about 2 years ago now, and before coming to Cornell, I spent 8 years in the New York City Mayor's office, culminating as the director of the Office of Climate and Sustainability. And one thing I was very excited about coming back to Cornell and to Ithaca is because Ithaca set these incredibly ambitious 2030 climate goals. And I think Susan can appreciate these are incredibly challenging goals. They're incredibly potentially disruptive to people's lives. And so the notion of being able to provide high quality, detailed, granular information to people who live in the community, to people who are making decisions about the community, policy decisions, investment decisions, and then on the individual project level. So being able to, really understand what is happening in an individual building and what types of steps could really help to develop a flood protection project or develop a building decarbonization project. To your point, so I am the executive director of something we call the 2030 Project, based out of the Cornell Atkinson Center for Sustainability. We support Cornell researchers in impact-oriented climate work, and we have a good number of them who are doing various types of projects with the city of Ithaca on buildings, on energy systems, working with their wastewater treatment plant to try to capture methane. So it's a wide range of projects, and so the notion of getting people around the table and supporting the city of Ithaca achieve these very, very challenging goals. I think the digital twin concept is incredibly powerful. I can't help but think, as someone who spent a lot of time, working in a mayor's office, thinking about the way politics works on a day-to-day level, that oftentimes information is not the limiting factor. Like, we know what we should be doing, we know what we're trying to do, and having ever more detailed and granular information is helpful up to a particular point. But I would say, when it comes to prioritization, right, understanding the real opportunities, for example, if you look at the city of Ithaca, there's about 6,000 buildings. You can sort of divide those into certain typologies. If you understand, things that would work in this building, there's 100 buildings of that type, versus there's 1,000 buildings of some other type. So if you say, okay, well, maybe it makes sense to prioritize from policy and investment point of view that larger category of buildings, you can see similarities, and then you can sort of base working in this sort of community of very high climate ambition. It's really hard, but I think it sort of just means we face the problems that everybody's going to face a little bit earlier than everyone else, and I think that's a good problem to have, and we're excited to be working with everyone to get it done.
Before I jump, sometimes cliches are there for a reason, of course.
Yeah, I agree with that.
I think at COP we also had enough discussions about we need to go beyond the silos.
Yeah.
Is this also something where you feel this kind of technology can help to really go beyond the silos?
I heard someone describe they're not silos, they're cylinders of excellence, which I thought was so funny. I do think we need to go beyond the silos, but I think, it's funny, I think political leaders can't afford to act in silos. They don't think about that. They show up at a town hall meeting, and one person is yelling about their electricity bill, another person is yelling about their cat that ran away, another person is yelling about the fact that their basement flooded, right? So I think, political leaders almost think holistically, and if they have visualizations, if they have tools that can see the city the way they see the city, which is like everything all together all at once, I think that can be really, really powerful and useful.
Susan, of course, I'm going to pass the same question to you, because I was working at local government before as well. And there was traditionally, when we're talking about elections, a policy agreement, and then you break it down into strategic and then operational goals. And before you know, after 2-3 years, you ask, do we ever do the other way around again, so that we bring all the results together and try to see, did we actually achieve what the political agreement was? Because usually we like to analyze, then say, that's the way we work. But the other way around doesn't happen so often. Is this also something where we can use data, tools, and technology to say, how do things correlate, and to see how we then maybe change our culture of working?
Yeah, I think absolutely. In Glasgow, we have what's called the strategic plan, which was essentially the manifesto that my party was elected on, combined with a little bit of the manifesto of the party that we're in partnership with. And then that gets turned into an operational plan, essentially, and handed over to officers to deliver over 5 years. There are it's big. It's a big piece of work. And although I have a cabinet of politicians whose job is to oversee various aspects of that, there's so much of it there's things that can probably go 2 or 3 years before we check in and say, what is happening with that? And it turns out everyone's forgotten about it and nothing's happening because we're too busy working on the other stuff. So yeah, I think there is something about using a digital twin to, and again, it's that ability to visualize, to then go, okay, what elements of the strategic plan can we fit into this visualization? What is this visualization telling us about all of the policy aims and the promises and pledges that we've made to citizens that we've told them we'll have delivered in 5 years' time? How many of them can we hit? How many of them can we advance using this particular visualization of this part of the city or of this element of policy that we're looking at, of, you know, whether it's around traffic interventions or whatever it is. So I do think there is something there that, because it allows everyone to visualize their bit alongside other people visualizing their bit as well. And there is something there, I think, that's quite powerful for having a holistic, one organisation approach to delivery, which, just because of the challenges of city government and the scale of what we're doing every single day, from emptying bins to educating children with profound developmental disabilities, for example, you know, all sorts of complexities in what we're doing, and there's some parts of the organisation never come together, but there is something about literally visualising problems that I think will allow us to come together much more effectively.
Khalid and Joel, I'm gonna come back, and I think we need to wrap up in not too long, but as Khalid already talked about learning, not only on the design, but also on the performance, it's maybe opening Pandora's box, but we talked a lot about AI today as well in the context of cities. Could we ever go to a point where you say there's digital twins that start learning from one another so that they can also feed in on what they see in one city to help design better policies in another city?
I think to say, can we ever get to a point is, we're already at that point in certain situations. So we're already using learning tools, for example, with mobility, where we're learning about systems, learning about the way people move and travel, and taking in real sensor data from certain cities and understanding how that means people move around. What are the trigger points? Why are people going to shops at a certain time? Why are people from different areas moving around? And then you can use that across to other cities, and each time you're learning more and more, and then you're bringing that together, and you're actually, as far as a machine is concerned, they don't know the difference between Glasgow or Swansea or Ithaca. So what they're interested in doing, they're starting to look at the models and starting to look at the data behind that, and then how we can optimize that. And you can go through any system you want, and you can start to see where you can make your big gains, like you were talking about, looking at all of the buildings and understanding, should we be looking at these 100 buildings, or is this 1,000 buildings over here? I mean, I'm sure looking at some of the models and some of the situations which are going on with flats in Ithaca will have similarities, not the same, but similarities to what's going on in Glasgow. And the more you can bring in that data and you can start to learn from that data, the better you'll get. But, and there is a big but, however much AI is going to help us with this, having that creativity and having that human insight into the understanding of how your city works and the understanding of the history and the culture and everything else related to that is needed on top of that. And that's why, as you were talking about, a digital twin is just a tool. It is not the solution. The solution lies with us as the humans. My head of research has got a lovely phrase which says, a fool with a tool is still a fool. And the tool can be as good as you like it to be, but we need to have the people who are working with that tool to make those decisions, and the AI will improve, and the machine learning will improve and really take us forward in those situations, but we've got to understand how that actually affects us back to our cities, and then feed that information back into the systems, and then let the citizens and everybody be involved in those decisions, so the decisions can be based on fact rather than other people's gut feeling and things like that.
Khalid, I saw you nodding. How do you use sensoring in terms of performance, and how do you bring it back to the design, but maybe also wider in the supply chain to see how can partners also learn from your experience?
From chain point of view, the entire supply chain has to be on board. What I mean by that, when you think about, let's say, even machines and equipment for a building. It's not just about the machine and the equipment. It has to be with the raw materials, with the parts, with the components that are actually feeding into that as well. It has to be part of that design cycle. Now, back to what I mentioned earlier, with the pre kind of modeling for design, you do have the most optimum design expectation that you would be aiming to, to gain. The performance monitoring and capturing, it should be in relation to what you optimized for before. But the beauty with it, that you always have the opportunity to continue optimizing and engineering, and that's what we actually do. But very critical to mention, to what you spoke about earlier, it has to be the entire chain. It couldn't be just one portion of it. It has to be from A to Z to get the maximum benefit.
Alice, I know you have to run, so I'm going to come first to you. Talking about optimization, how do you bring in that whole systems perspective in the work you do with cities?
So I think if you, first of all, think about what we have to do to get to net zero, then you need to think about, well, how do we do it in a systematic way? Like if we look at the emissions profile of our cities, most of the emissions in our cities relate to energy, relate to buildings, relate to transport. And, the things that a city can actually do most about absolutely relate to buildings and transport. But the piece that most people forget is actually urban planning. And the reality is that you cannot have a net zero city if it's not a compact city. If you think about, I think two good examples of this is if you look at Pittsburgh versus Stockholm, similar size population. Pittsburgh uses 5 times more land than Stockholm, and Pittsburgh has 5 times more emissions than Stockholm. So that really demonstrates that compactness is a critical element. So in terms of thinking about the things that you have to approach, the greatest opportunity in terms of your long-term objectives to drive change is your urban plan. And I think you've got to demonstrate using, for example, digital twin technology, the change that you're going to bring to your buildings, the change that you're going to bring, how you're going to create green and thriving neighborhoods, for example, how you're going to create connected buildings. You need to demonstrate that, how it connects to EV charging infrastructure, etc. So I think you need to demonstrate that to the public so they can provide their comments on the urban plan, and that's something that we do. I think the other side is, unfortunately, we have a lot of conflicts in the world, and one of the things that we're often called upon to do is to help multilateral development banks and international organizations, unfortunately, try and put a price on damage. So that is another thing, that when you're looking at rebuilding an entire city, you want to rebuild that city and rebuild that country in accordance with the best environmental standards. So we can use technology in that regard to understand what was there before, understand what's there now, and understand the level of damage associated with war. It's generally war, unfortunately, or a major natural disaster, and understand the cost of reconstruction. And that helps the multilateral development agencies then go out there and seek to get pledges from countries to rebuild. And that's something that we've unfortunately found to an increasing extent that we're asked to do. But equally, in a number of countries that I've operated within, it's remarkable the number of cities that don't actually know how many car parking spaces they have. And so we have found ourselves, even in countries like Germany, having to use technology to identify the number of car parking spaces they have. And that's critical in terms of road space reallocation, for identifying where you could have micro-mobility hubs, for example, to identify bays for people who have disabilities or for deliveries. And it's critical in terms of thinking about the car parking that you can reallocate for alternative uses, or the car parking you can cut, the fiscal measures you need to introduce to try and encourage people to stop driving into the city and parking in the city. So, technology can help you with the baseline data, and to enable you to make smart, informed decisions. And that's definitely something that we're increasingly seeing in a lot of our transport work. Buildings as well, exactly what Johnson Controls said. For all of our buildings projects, every single project, we use digital twin technology in buildings. But the other thing is that we made a commitment at COP26 that for all of our buildings projects that we would monitor whole life cycle carbon assessments, whether our clients wanted it or not. And some clients, they really don't understand what you're talking about. But if you can visualize that and show them what you're talking about, they're more likely to adopt a sustainable approach. So we use it in that regard in buildings too.
Very short, as we need to wrap up. Ben, I'm going to ask a last question to you, and then Steve, come to you. With your background in the mayor's office, if we talk about a systems approach, what I often worry about is that if you look at training and education, how do we put in education and training already that whole systems thinking, so that whether you're an engineer, whether you're a lawyer, whether you're like a sociologist, how to bring in those to make sure that later in life you know how to bring them also together?
That's a great question. Something I would say in the mayor's office is that there was always this, I think, very healthy, productive tension and dialogue between generalists and specialists, and training people to both be extreme experts in the field that they're in, while also recognizing the context in which their expertise sits. As I sort of mentioned, in a place like the mayor's office, it comes very naturally because, we come and deal with a problem in a place, and that problem, of course, I think about like a New York City street. You have the street, which is controlled by the Department of Transportation. You have the fire hydrant, which is controlled by the fire department. You have the sewer and water system under the street that's controlled by the Department of Environmental Protection. You have like the width of the street that's determined by the length of the fire truck that's able to go down there. So you have all of these people who are all engaged, but when the mayor's office comes and swoops into a particular location, they just see the street and they see all these things, and they have to think holistically. So, I think training people to understand where their specialty, and we need real specialists, fits into these broader contexts is going to be critical.
Steve, last question to you. We talk a lot about long-term whole systems approach and so on, but you still work a lot with mayors, and they probably say, but I need to get re-elected, so I also want to see something in the years to come. So how to marry that ambition on the long term, but still needing to deliver on the short term?
Well, yeah, I mean, critically, maybe Susan's probably better to answer this than I am, but from what I've seen, the sort of political leaders of cities, certainly in the UK, around this agenda, is that there is widespread support for achieving their net zero ambitions. They may not have the full support of national government currently in that regard, but I think it's certainly something the majority of their citizens seek and ask for. I think one of the things, again, that digital twins can really help answer this is visualising some of the benefits that can be accrued and captured on the back of net zero investment. And we can talk about a whole range, not just of environmental and financial benefits, but those co-benefits in terms of jobs growth, better green infrastructure that gives people better mental health and physical health access to that, and the savings that will mean in terms of the health provider, and of course bringing people back into work and increasing the productivity of people and the city. So I think there's a lot, I think, that net zero can play in terms of those political cycles. I think the majority of political parties, certainly in the UK, are up for it. They certainly are. It's just that mechanism of how to deliver against it, which there are differences. But I think, going back to digital twins, there's a really good opportunity, I think, to sort of visualise that piece. And I'll finish by saying, I think it was in 2001, wasn't it, the earthquake in Christchurch, and there was a unique opportunity in that city to rethink and replan that particular city. And they made that decision in terms of the political administration to really put in a very strong digital infrastructure across the city to help plan how the city was developed in the future, but also operationalise it and to ensure that the city moved and functioned in a really efficient way. And I think that was I didn't follow where the political cycle went after that, but for me as a citizen, had I lived in Christchurch, I thought that's a good thing to be doing.
Super, thanks a lot. Nitin, we're going to wrap up here. Thanks for all the insights. I think there's still a lot of work to be done, and I think it's also bringing all those experiences and expertises together, but looking forward to stay in touch and to find each other as partners along the way. So thanks so much.
Thank you. Thanks,
Thank you. Although we have come to the end of this day, but we are going to have a movie displayed. We are going to display a movie now. May I request Becca, if she's around, to come and let us know more about this film? Let's look for Becca. Becca. It's been a bit of a fishing mission, to be perfectly honest.